is termed by Nick Walker, an autistic scholar and activist. And it's something neurodiversity activists see as the thing we need to overcome for liberation. And the pathology paradigm is the overall kind of framework or paradigm which both underpins our psychological sciences, psychiatry, related fields, to an extent neurology, and blends in with medicine more generally, but also goes in these kind of other directions through the various fields of psychology, how workplace management, the way workers are kind of constantly assessed and measured for productivity and ranked against each other and pushed to outperform each other in these various ways, and then all the way back to kind of school where people are assessed in exams and again ranked. So the pathology paradigm is supposed to draw attention to how this is a kind of pervasive paradigm that we all live with it. And it structures everything from school to the workplace to medicine to the way to end of life care. I think everyone here will have experienced this, even if people have not thought of it in these terms. Not just neurodivergent people, as well, neurotypical people. People who, so neurotypical, when I say that, I just mean people who are socially considered normal in a given society, right? Depending on that society's norm. Not to not have a mental, neurological disability. Neurotypical people also experience this pressure. No one can live up to it, not completely, not all the time. No one can be themselves completely, no one can discover who they might be, because no one can be perfectly within that kind of normal ideal or supernormal ideal. You mentioned psychoactive medications. I mean, these are just one technology. Of course, many people find them helpful, but in certain ways they might just be used, if we look at the collective level, to increase productivity, to allow people to remain in employment so profit can be extracted in ways that wear us down in the long run. And then once we've been worn down, we will experience maybe like burnout. People talk about burnout a lot today from work. And then you have to go off and be fixed again and sent back in until they can't fix you anymore, and then you're abandoned usually, in one way or another. So I think it forces us all to compete in every sense, and forces everything in human life is ordered the way we're reproduced, as we were saying, from right from birth, from before you're born. The whole social reproduction of the human is geared towards this. And it's not a situation in which people can thrive, and in many ways it's getting worse.
Hi ha un concepte que evidentment tu agafes de la proposta de Marx, que és el concepte d'alienació, i també ho penses en relació a com aquesta reproducció, no, de l'estructura de la normalitat que ens oprimeix cada vegada més ens està allunyant de nosaltres mateixes, no? D'espais subjectius de nosaltres mateixes i a la vegada dels altres. Com aquesta llunyania ens fa més difícil, dificultós, la possibilitat de poder fer en comú, no? La possibilitat d'observar, concebir l'altre com un igual, com un còmplice, com una persona amb la que puc ser més fort, més forta, més forti, i no com a aquesta amenaça, fins i tot per la meva possibilitat de vida.
Yes, so, I mean, when Marx himself was writing about alienation, he was thinking about primarily the factories of the Industrial Revolution and the ways people were being alienated from parts of their bodies, but also their developmental capacities. It's hard to develop as a person if you're just at a repetitive machine, 7 days a week, for all of every day. He said it ruins our bodies and our minds and stops us from being able to connect to each other and, I guess, understand each other as fully human, in a sense. I went with that concept, but wanted to look more at how alienation might be different today. I draw on many other thinkers who have theorized this in various ways. Some concepts I found helpful was the concept of emotional labor. Today we have, of course, a mass kind of shift towards a service economy. But one of my early jobs was serving. I was selling food and coffees in a fast food place, and I was absolutely terrible at it. And the whole range of cognitive and sensory and emotional capacities you have to do that job is quite incredible, really. And it was a low-paid job. It was seen as you didn't need any training or 1 day of training. It was seen as the most unskilled kind of job. But to do that, you've got to communicate with people. You've got to pretend you're happy and smiling. And you get told off if you don't do this, if you look unhappy, or if you don't comport yourself emotionally in exactly the right way. At the same time, you've got to remember all their orders. They're ordering 6 kinds of coffee, or something like this, with different milks and these kinds of things. So you've got to have these capacities of memory. At the same time, there's all these sensory things going on. It's a busy place. There are all these noises, bright lights, the kind of lights that just didn't exist 100 years ago, which humans never evolved to live around, right? These kind of big invasive strip lights which are blaring at you with this kind of overwhelming, exactly what's going on here. And you have to deal with all of this at the same time for hours and hours and hours, day after day after day. And that kind of alienation is, I think it's so hard to grow as a person or develop or to even function. I don't want to say to be clear, I don't want to say it's worse than working in a factory in the Industrial Revolution. That was absolutely terrible in all sorts of different ways. But I do want to say that alienation has changed and has become more about our minds for many of us anyway. Of course, many. This is also in jobs which are considered to be manual jobs. I worked in a packaging factory for a big, doing night shifts for a postal company, and the way you're monitored through all these technologies, making sure you're as productive as possible. Everyone who worked there was drinking these horrible energy drinks to be able to stay awake and to be productive. You cannot stop for one moment. Again, it's a manual job, but it's cognitively and emotionally it's so alienating. Now these are just 2 very concrete examples, but I think they exemplify the overall orientation of the economy and the world in various ways, and how alienation is changing, and in particular contributing to, or in some cases causing, all kinds of mass mental, neurological, cognitive, and emotional disablement and unwellness. And people today, of course, talk about mental health epidemics and stuff like this. There are debates about whether this is really happening or not. I mean, I think it's pretty clear that something like this is happening and it relates to this system. So that's the kind of alienation I have in mind, although there are so many other forms as well, the whole way people are reproduced. Yeah, it's getting harder for people to live in certain ways, even while our lives may be getting easier in other ways, right? You know, as certain technologies make lives easier in certain ways, we, to the same extent, just have these new forms of alienation.
El que estem convidats a fer davant d'aquest patiment, davant d'aquesta alienació cognitiva, emocional, subjectiva, també corporal, és anar cap a la privatització del malestar. Nosaltres ho sabem, qualsevol persona que aquí hagi intentat trobar un espai d'escolta dins de la xarxa d'atenció pública de salut mental a qualsevol centre d'atenció primària, no? Dins de la seguretat social, segurament s'ha trobat amb una oferta d'una visita gairebé cada 3 mesos a nivell individual i al voltant d'un espai de 20 minuts, mitja hora. No estic dient que això sigui una solució, però si no tenim diners, si no tenim una xarxa, persones al voltant que ens puguin acompanyar, amb qui podem confiar, amb qui puguem recolzar-nos, gairebé el que podem trobar és aquesta possibilitat massa mínima, no? Massa desesperançadora. Ara, com trobes que aquest altre paradigma, no? El que anomenes paradigma de la normalitat, de la neurodiversitat, perdoneu el lapsus, ens podria donar una certa esperança, no? Fins i tot una certa possibilitat de reconnexió amb algo de la pròpia vitalitat, no només a nivell individual, sinó també en relació al vincle, al llaç social amb els altres.
Yeah, it's good to also talk about something more hopeful, because so far, I mean, we've spoken about some harms everyone is experiencing, I think, right now, in different ways and to different extents. The neurodiversity paradigm is an idea from the neurodiversity movement. It's not my idea. I have been part of developing it, but it's a mass collective effort. I think to understand it, it's helpful to just say a bit about the neurodiversity movement. It basically began in the 1990s when the internet allowed, for the first time, lots of autistic people to connect with each other. And all of them had been told their problems were individual medical problems and they needed to become more normal. And many had been forced into very invasive attempts to make them more normal through therapies and things like this. And when they got together and began speaking to each other, they realized that they could actually, the things that everyone else wanted to eliminate from them and from their personalities and their ways of functioning, they found that they often appreciated these things in each other because they were all autistic. And from this, there was a kind of period of consciousness raising, and eventually, collectively, these groups developed the idea of neurodiversity and this idea of the neurodiversity paradigm. And the basic idea is it's an ideal, it's something to be collectively developed, but it moves away from this pathology paradigm of focusing always on everyone in relation to the norm, and then devaluing people and pathologizing people who seem to fall below that norm, and seeing their problems as individual medical problems. And instead it says, we'll start from the basis that diversity itself is normal, not the average. Diversity is the norm. And then it takes a further step and just says, and every individual, how well they'll be able to function, or to thrive, or to relate to other people, will be determined, at least in significant part, by the environment they're in. If someone is not thriving, then we need to change the environment. We don't just need to change the individual. And that was the basic idea of the neurodiversity paradigm. Now, the idea there is to create a paradigm shift, both on the one hand, in relation to all our relevant sciences, the psychological sciences and psychiatry and so forth, to rethink the fundamental assumptions and completely change them, but also to have a kind of broader cultural paradigm shift, just in how people are represented or thought about, how we think about disability. For instance, moving away from seeing disability as something to be ashamed of, to having pride in our disabled communities and our histories of resistance and so on. In the book, I both embrace and critique this idea of the neurodiversity paradigm. It's something I worked on for a long time. I've done lots of research on how to change our sciences and things like this as a philosopher of science. And it's something I believe in fully, but over many years I've come to this realization that the pathology paradigm that we're trying to overcome is so intimately intertwined with capitalism as a system that you cannot have a neurodiversity paradigm within capitalism. That's one of the claims I make in the book, one of the core claims, and something I try to show. So I believe fully in trying to build a neurodiversity paradigm still, but I don't think this change can just be scientific and cultural. It also has to attend to the much deeper structures of our society, including the economic ones. So the neurodiversity paradigm is part something that we're currently building. It is being built. There are so many people working on this right now. There are people, when I say people working on it, I mean anything from any activist writing about it or talking about it or teaching about it in their local spaces, all the way to scientists working on how to change, how to think about normality and these kinds of things. But for it to be successful, I think there will have to be these deeper changes as well. That's the hope and that's the challenge.
En el llibre parla justament del risc de que els moviments de la neurodivergència, a més de ser assimilats per les estructures neoliberals, es puguin quedar acomodats a una defensa de drets i a un possible canvi de lleis, però dins d'institucions i de propostes socials que potser continuaríem reproduint aquesta asfíxia normativa, no? Aquesta violència de la normalitat. Veus que això pugui estar passant, hagi passat?
Yeah, so I've seen this happen. I became involved in neurodiversity activism over a decade ago now, and even the term neurodiversity wasn't widely known then. It was like a tiny corner of the internet, basically, and some activist groups. Now it's everywhere. It's being used in schools and in the papers and these kinds of things. And we really believed we were, building this new paradigm, and we were trying to do this, and we were then really pleased when more and more people started using these terms and using these concepts. We thought, we are getting somewhere, this will lead to change. But then it became increasingly clear for many of us that these concepts were being adopted in a superficial way. So people would change the terms they used. So instead of saying, this person has a mental disorder, they would say, they're neurodivergent or neurodivergent. And on the surface, that looks like they've changed their paradigm, they've changed their thinking. But then they didn't necessarily change the practices, they were still trying to normalize or treat people. So you have this kind of co-option, which is sometimes called neurodiversity light, in the sense of like Coke, Pepsi light. At the same time, you have this very specific neoliberal approach to neurodiversity inclusion. And it says, we now recognize that where we thought you just had deficits before, that you've actually got strengths, and that's good. So they'll say some autistic people, for instance, can have very strong logical capacities, or be very good systems thinkers, or be very good at mathematics or working with computers. And then they say, so we can perhaps accept some autistic people, and we'll have some inclusion initiatives to get more autistic people into the workforce. And it's become the dominant approach. I would call this neoliberal neurodiversity. I don't think that will help us. It might help some people at a very individual level, in a very meaningful sense, because if someone, for instance, out of work and struggling, and then they are able to get into work, that does help them, of course. But it leaves the underlying logics of the pathology paradigm and the system completely intact. It says we still value people by their productivity or productive potentials. We still disvalue people who we see as unproductive. The only thing it changes is they say, well, we now recognise that some of the people we thought were unproductive are actually capable of being more productive. So it's still the same system. At the same time, those people, neurodivergent people who are helped into work, they're still always the first to be let go if there's people are being laid off. Not just neurodivergent people, but people from any marginalised group, of course, but neurodivergence is one of those groups. People are allowed in as long as they can be exploited, but then this will again lead to this situation of burnout, and as so many people, because you can only perform like that so long, and then as soon as that happens, you're abandoned again, you're pushed out and no longer valued. I think the dominant form of neurodiversity, as it's being co-opted by this neoliberal version, is not changing anything. It's just more of the same. The other thing you asked about was the rights-based approach. Now, I want to be clear that I think the rights-based approach is extremely important and extremely good. It's been the dominant approach for neurodiversity activists. We basically now have disability rights, most different in different nations, but often in the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was lots of new legislation in different places, which would protect people from discrimination in work in relation to disability, and in education, and allow us to have accommodations. And the basic strategy of the neurodiversity movement has been to say, we are disabled too, so we deserve those rights, and to demand recognition, and therefore access in school and the workplace. And this is really important and really good, and we have to defend those rights. At the same time, I don't think it goes far enough. I don't think everyone actually gets access to those rights, especially multiply marginalized neurodivergent people. The statistics for the amount of neurodivergent people in prison is horrific. We don't have a really good understanding of this, but there have been various studies. One study in a prison in Chelmsford in the UK found that over 50% of the prisoners had dyslexia. So that's just one form of neurodivergence. There are similarly high statistics for ADHD in prisons, for people who are autistic. There's a very clear school-to-prison pipeline. And it's not clear to me, for instance, what good workplace rights are if you're in prison you're alone, if that's what's there from the beginning. And that tends to be for multiply marginalized neurodivergent people, people who are neurodivergent and black, neurodivergent and from a poor family, neurodivergent and trans, or sitting at these various intersections. So rights are both really important, but they ultimately, I guess the other thing is finally they don't change the system. They help us fit in and exist a bit. And that is a genuine real gain, but we still end up with all these problems, the ones we've spoken about already, basically, the situation that we're currently in. A final thing to say is that we're living through right now a global backlash against these rights, as we're living through a global backlash against many other progressive gains. Right now, people in far-right politicians and far-right political parties who are either in power or closer to gaining power than they have been in many parts of the world are increasingly focused on neurodivergent people. Among other groups, they focus on migrants, they focus on transgender people. Among these other groups, they're increasingly focused on neurodivergent people. In the UK, just a week or two ago, our leading far-right politician, Nigel Farage, he did a speech about how there's too many people are being diagnosed and how it's turning us all into victims, and how he doesn't think we're really disabled. He thinks that we're just part of a victimhood culture kind of thing. But that's also coming at the same time as our government is leading a mass attack on disabled people's social supports and trying to take away lots of the financial benefits disabled people have. These things are very much interrelated. And I think this is important to understand as a backlash against disability rights, because what disability rights have done, including in relation to neurodiversity, but also more broadly, is they allow us to upset what the fascist sees as the natural order. And for them, the natural order is that there are some people who are inherently better and some people who are inherently worse. And they do this along different dimensions, whether it's race or gender, and one of these dimensions is in terms of ability. And when they see a neurodivergent school child use their disability rights to get extra time in an exam, or they see a neurodivergent adult use their disability rights to get accommodations in the workplace, what they see is someone upsetting this natural order and upsetting the extent to which people can be exploited and dominated. So at the moment there's an attempt to reverse that. So I think this is very important to add on at the end, just because even though I have this critique of the limitation of the rights-based approach, I also want to say the rights are so incredibly important and need to be defended, but we need to go also beyond this. Otherwise, they will be taken away and things will get worse. Yeah, that's the real risk right now for many people.
Pensem juntis com ho veieu. Teniu preguntes, dubtes, crits, sorolls de les entranyes, o voleu dir alguna cosa? No cal que sigui algo super il·luminat, estructurat, de no sé què, citant a no sé qui. El que surti del cos també ens va molt bé.
Hola. En castellano, en inglés, que da igual. ¿Se escucha? Sí. Bueno, castellano. Mi nombre es Carolina, soy médico de familia, soy médica de la atención primaria. Sí, hola. Cuando hablan, dentro de todos los temas que tocaban, hay un punto de repente en que, sobre todo en el tema de la atención a nivel de salud mental y la atención a la gente, yo misma estando, aprendiendo hace 2 años también a entenderme dentro de lo que vendría a ser mi neurodivergencia y aprendiendo a funcionar en el sistema sanitario, yo creo que es un tema que no, dentro de los, es como que no se considera que los médicos también podemos ser neurodivergentes, y es un sistema que no te permite trabajar tranquilo. Yo tengo ganas de trabajar, tengo ganas de hacer las cosas, pero por mucho que lo expliques, de partida te dicen, ¿por qué no lo dijiste antes? Como si tuviera que ser mi carta de presentación. Y sobre todo veo esto de incluso conversarlo con pares. Hace poco hubo un encuentro de salud comunitaria, esa gente que, médicos de familia que se dedican a la comunitaria, tendrán bastante conciencia, y el solo hecho de haberles dicho, oye, sería bueno que en este tipo de reuniones se tenga una sala de silencio para estar un rato tranquilo, y entre las charlas y todo eso fue como, no lo habíamos pensado. Y pensaba, pero son 2 o 3 días de un exceso de gente, de información y todo, y eso era como, ya, información que de repente se entregaba. Ya le digo, pero es que esto no queda tan claro. No, es que si no te interesa, la gente no es que no le interese. Y no porque no le interese, no se van a leer un párrafo completo. Facilita la información. No tienes problemas con facilitar la información cuando es de otro idioma o una persona de otra cultura, pero si te digo esto, facilítalo, porque si no, no se entiende y lo tomas como que falta de interés. Bueno, nada, era simplemente abrir el melón de que en el área sanitaria habemos algunos, que no sé cuántos serán, que gracias también a las características que tenemos por cómo somos, conectamos muy bien con la gente, nos dedicamos el tiempo, pero nos quemamos y salí llorando al final del día porque no podía hacer las cosas y te piden más de lo que tenés que hacer. Creo que el melón de sanitarios con algún tipo de neurodivergencia no, es como si no pasara, como cuando dicen los médicos no se enferman. Bueno, eso. Gracias.
On the early chapters of your book, you talk about before colonialism on the global south, there were sort of a collectivism in where the disabled people were able to find a place in society regardless of the kind of disabled, be it physical or mental. And then when the global north and colonialism arrives, we started to make the shift that we have nowadays towards individuality and blaming ourselves for our success or our failure, and blaming ourselves whether we have or don't have neurodiversity. I myself am also neurodivergent. I'm an anti-stigma activist, and you also propose that we should try to go back to a sort of organization similar to those we had back in the days in the Global South. I myself think that syndicalism is a pretty decent middle ground. Nevertheless, the issue I have found in all the workplaces I worked lately is that the neoliberal system doesn't allow workers to find a common space to speak to each other, usually because you have short breaks or because the breaks are segregated in really small groups, so you have trouble to find like-minded people, you have trouble to find other neurosciences, as I like to say, and to organize yourself and collectivize. So I would ask you, how do you think we could overcome this difficulty that the system has found, that discourage organization?
Thank you. Just to answer that last question, I do want to say when I definitely don't want to turn back and try to directly emulate any of these previous movements. Like, I'm not saying we need to form something like the Black Panthers and do exactly what they did, because they made their analysis and their practice for a very specific place, a very specific legal context, a very specific cultural and historical context, which cannot be emulated anywhere else. And also it failed in many ways, even in that context. So I'm not saying we just emulate them. I still think we can learn from people. We can learn from their limitations and mistakes and errors, as well as some things that maybe they got right. As well as all of these things open up new dangers though, right? So let's say we decide to make this a mass political party, a radical neurodivergent political party, something a bit like the Black Panthers, then instantly you'll get things like infiltration and assassination. As soon as you start to genuinely challenge the order, then you get new threats, basically. So I want to be very careful what I say here, because I'm trying to learn from these various movements and people, but it's not something I think I have any kind of clear answer to. Again, it's something that just has to be developed collectively from my perspective. Yeah. Would you like to add anything?
Sí, gràcies. A la companya que parla, no, de que els metges no s'enfermen mai, gràcies per compartir tu en aquest lloc i amb aquesta trobada amb aquesta gent que deies el que estaves vivint. Crec que amb petits gestos, parlant del que passa, parlant del que necessitem, estem construint també la realitat. Estem desmuntant aquesta ficció de que estem tots bé i continuarem encara millor quan ningú de nosaltres està bé. No? Això ho dèiem i ho podeu llegir i també segurament ho viviu. Aquests ritmes, aquesta acceleració en què vivim, és impossible trobar-nos bé. Així com tampoc és possible trobar-nos bé quan no tenim espai per parlar amb la gent amb què treballem, amb qui passem 4, 6, 8 hores cada dia. Que aquesta impossibilitat de comunicació estigui dissenyada per preservar l'individualisme i la nostra solitud, saber-ho ja crec que va bé. I després poder anar en el sentit contrari potser també ens va bé i també ens permet tornar a trobar-nos amb algo d'una certa desobediència necessària, una certa rebel·lia necessària, una certa no participació dins d'algunes regles del joc. Segurament no podem fer totes noves cada dia, o és una gran feina, però sí que podem, crec, desobeir fins i tot d'una manera mínima. A vegades dir hola a algú no conegut, a vegades somriure, és un acte de rebel·lia. I ho sento, si semblo molt naïf i molt innocent i molt no sé què, però realment crec que és així. Convivim amb persones que no reben mai cap gest de reconeixement sobre la seva existència pròpia. El fet de donar-nos aquest reconeixement implica tota una aposta per la vida, i estem en un moment en què cal defensar la vida dins de la seva mínima expressió i també dins de la seva màxima expressió. Segurament poder parlar, no?, amb qui tens al costat, Déu-n'hi-do, ja fa molt. No dic que sigui només això, però poder fer-ho ja canvia les coses. Tu volies dir alguna cosa més?
No, I think, yeah. Also, just to say thank you for sharing this story, I guess, about not having neurodivergence recognized as a doctor. This is something I hear a lot from doctors and other medical professionals. Yeah, it's. I mean, I guess I would. It's hard to get recognized for being neurodivergent anywhere, and it manifests in different ways for different people, because there's a lot of pressure to not recognize it. Because again, if you recognize it, then you have to do things like have accommodations, and that might disrupt productivity or the standardized workday and so forth. And it manifests in all these different complex ways in different professions and then there's further complications. Yeah. So, but yeah, thank you for sharing that.
Okay. I just wanted your thoughts on tech feudalism. Economist Yanis Varoufakis claims that capitalism is dead and we're now living in a techno-feudal system. Do you have any thoughts on that? Just curious what you think about tech lords, tech oligarchy, and tech feudalism.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting concept, and I guess I am sympathetic to some extent in the sense something is definitely changing, and we do have this kind of new billionaire class who have these kind of platforms, and I can see that there is an analogy there to be made with feudalism. But I don't think that capitalism is dead, and he seems to think that we are no longer living in capitalism. I think that's wrong. Capitalism can take many forms, and it's always had elements of those kind of feudal relations within capitalism, which are different in different nations and cultures, and in relation to all sorts of complex, different historical processes. But it's still capitalism, I think. So he's right that something has changed. He's right that it's bad. This is not a good situation to be in. We do have these new overlords in some sense, a new kind of ruling class. But I wouldn't say that it's no longer capitalism. I think that's kind of, his analysis goes a bit wrong there. I think it's just a new form of capitalism. or a further part of its development. He doesn't write about neurodiversity, but I do think it does relate to neurodiversity. I mean, we have these people who have such incredible power in all sorts of things in our lives, right? We live in a kind of age of, I sometimes would call it algorithmic neuronormativity or something like this. These people with these platforms can tweak an algorithm which will completely change how our attention is focused or the information we receive, and this can impact us in so many ways, like how distressed we get, how tired we are. So there are new forms of neuronormativity emerging and growing and intensifying in relation to these kind of tech overlords. But I think it's still capitalism.
Molt ràpidament.